Is very limited, unfortunately. As Joanne was already alluding to, there will be a reception afterwards, so there will be ample time also for interaction and conversation there. I want to kick off this session with a quiz. Just to get you on your toes, because we need to, as I said, work hard. So are you ready for a quiz? We heard from Argentina how they're using the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review to guide their SDG implementation. The Universal Periodic Review being a peer review mechanism under the Human Rights Council. And we do think this has the potential also to guide SDG implementation. So we have been kind of mapping out the UPR recommendations to see to what extent they actually link to the SDGs. So there will be a few questions now that you can either test your knowledge or test your imagination. So which goals, among the 17 goals, which goal links to the most UPR recommendations? Thinking about human rights mechanisms, are they most concerned with goal 5 on gender equality? Is it goal 8 on decent work? Or is it goal 16 on peace, security, and strong institutions? You got it right, most of you. Most of the UPR recommendations are actually focusing on goal 16, which reflects most of the civil and political rights. A huge proportion of the UPR recommendations also relate to goal 5, whereas goal 8 on decent work and fundamental labor rights come in the third place. And now we will go to the next question. And I can see the players are getting ready, so can you start the countdown, please? Well, there. Oh, you jumped, you skipped one. Anyway, I think it's there are some technical problems. What we wanted to show you with the quiz, so just call it off, Paloma. What we wanted to show you with the quiz is also how few recommendations the human rights system is producing on some of the key goals. So, for example, if we look at goal 7 on energy, if we look at goal 6 on water, there are very few human rights recommendations directed at these goals. So, well, you missed the quiz, so you will all be considered winners for this session. This session of the afternoon is really about tools and approaches, and I'm therefore very happy to, as the first speaker for our session here, call on Marianne Beisheim, who is a German academic researcher who has been really deeply involved in designing the follow-up and review architecture for the 2030 agenda. Marianne is from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and I'm very curious to hear from you, Marianne, having worked on the design, and now we're 2 years into implementation. What do you see? Is this what you expected when you set off to work on this?
All right. Thank you very much. Is this working? Not yet, maybe? Yes, now it is. Hello, everybody. Before I start, I have to really say I have to commend you all that you are still here and that you aim at digesting all this information. It's incredible. So I didn't prepare, or I will not give you my full speech, as I think, you have heard so many things already, so I'll rather try to answer Birgitte's question. Well, when I started to work on this, I imagined that the HLPF would be an element that helps really as a means of implementation to work with the SDGs. I kept saying to the negotiators, listen, you put so much effort into negotiating the set of goals and the whole agenda, you need something to work with these SDGs afterwards. And the idea was to set up something like a cycle of accountability, really to work with these goals, not only here at the United Nations, but actually to use the HLPF to foster national and local level implementation. So in a way, the HLPF itself should be seen as a tool, since this is the headline of our session. See the HLPF as a tool with also the good wording that you find in the 2030 agenda. The principles are fine. The wording is fine in the agenda. It says we want a robust and effective, participatory, inclusive, transparent, integrated, people-centered, gender-sensitive review, respecting human rights, having a particular focus on the poorest, most vulnerable, and those furthest behind. This is a quote from the actual 2030 agenda. But to bring this to life, of course, is something else. It was very hard to integrate accountability into the agenda because some member states didn't want the A word in there. So the only way we got it in was in saying promote accountability to your citizens. So this is what it is all about, promote accountability to your citizens, and member states couldn't really say, well, we don't want that, right? So now it's in there and we really need to push for it. And it also says, the wording also says, national and subnational reviews should draw on contributions from indigenous people, civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders, which is fine. But then it says, in line with national circumstances, policies, and priorities. And of course, this is somehow an opening clause. So again, we need to push to bring this into life. So what we try to say, and when I say we, I'm thinking also of an initiative called Partners for Review, which has been initiated by the German government, but it's supposed to be a multi-stakeholder platform for a coalition of willing of all those, that is both member states, civil society, and other stakeholders that are interested in a robust review mechanism. And this for us mainly means to make member states understand that this is not about these 15 minutes that we're going to see upcoming next week, where they present what they say they have done, but it's about the preparatory process at the local and national level. So how do you set up this inclusive national review that fulfills all these principles that I have quoted? And we try to bring together those countries that have already participated. For example, last year it was 22 countries, with those countries that now volunteer to go next and to make them talk about how they did it, what are good practices, what worked well, in order to go beyond what we got in the agenda and to make talk translate into action. So this is the idea, and also the Partners for Review initiative could be then one tool. So Birgitte and I agreed to have rather like a conversation, so maybe you have another question for me.
Yes, I will, but that will be later, because
okay.
First I want to ask a question to the lady sitting next to you. Because next to you, Marianne, is Pratima Gurung, who is an indigenous person from Nepal. And Nepal is one of the countries that is reporting this year to the HLPF. And Pratima, you're also representing the Indigenous Peoples Global Network of Persons with Disabilities. So from the country perspective, how have you been able to engage? How have you been able to bring that, these beautiful words that Marianne mentioned, into life from your perspective?
Thank you, organizer, for providing me this opportunity to speak on the behalf of Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network, representing myself as an Indigenous woman with disabilities from the very least developed country, that is Nepal, where 50% of the total population are women, 40% are Indigenous peoples, and 2% are persons with disabilities. To share my experiences relating with the SDG process and the engagement with the VNR process, we find that these groups were invisible. There were lack of consultations and coordinations with these groups in the whole process of planning, implementation, and in the VNR report. So in the 2 years engagement and the implementation of the 2030 agenda, I still want to question myself as a right holder. Where are we as peoples? Where are we as peoples? We as right holders, we have different identities. I would like behind, reaching the farthest behind. Has it been to us? Is the world fit and filled for all of us? We realize that it has to be real in our lives on the ground. We need to frame our own the SDG and the development process, our values and cultures and the systems that we have been realizing and addressing the diversity of our heterogeneity and our needs linking with the development. These are the fundamental things that we need to realize within this process. In the long process of our challenges and the celebration as Indigenous women with disabilities, we believe that now, at least, human rights do not emerge. They are to be claimed and recognized as right holders. So to claim as right holders, we need to fill and develop a framework addressing the intersectional of inequalities and discriminations faced by women, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities, relating with some of the qualitative informations based on the ground and lived experiences. We also like to engage in some kind of enabling environment for Indigenous peoples' effective participation at local level with the government, development partners, and stakeholders in planning, implementation, and monitoring process at the national level. We also like to have the 2030 agenda to ensure at least the disaggregated data should be the fundamental things, and that should be based on gender, ethnicity, disability, relating with some of the experience that we have been doing as community-based monitoring and Indigenous navigators. We also would like to create and strengthen supporting environment, including for all Indigenous peoples, relating with their social, economical, cultural, and health aspects relating with poverty and development. We would like to urge two processes. One is the bottom-to-top approach and top-to-bottom approach, relating from the local, regional, and at the global level, relating with both the duty bearers and right holders. Lastly, we want to think the approaches like we want to bridge the gap among the stakeholders. It's a cross-movement collaboration, partnerships with people-centered and inclusive approach, and that has to be done in a twin-track approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think complementary views here. Marianne spoke about it's not about the 15 minutes of fame that states will get in New York. It's about the national processes. Can you say something, Marianne, about what is the relationship between the global and the national? How is that foreseen in the follow-up and review architecture?
Well, it's not really foreseen as such, but we need to make it happen. What I hear, for example, in the network Partners for Review is that many colleagues from member states say that the global event helped them to really push their colleagues from those line ministries that are not mainly involved. So they could say to their colleagues, listen, we need to go global. We will present this in July to the United Nations community, and that's why we need to go beyond business as usual. So it helped them to create a momentum, to create a new higher level of ambition, and that is one of those links that I think is really crucial, to use the HLPF to not only have a deadline, you know, you have to have your report ready in that very moment, or your strategy or your roadmap, whatever it is, but also to push the level of ambition.
So push the level of ambition. Now we're also pushing the levels of ambition with regards to our technology. Pratima mentioned the Indigenous Navigator. I'm not sure if you all know what the Indigenous Navigator is. Perhaps Joji will help us explain that before, but we wanted to give you a live idea of what the Indigenous Navigator is. It's a tool for Indigenous peoples' participatory monitoring. So if you are ready with your cell phones, you will be asked. Oops. Yeah. Okay, so people are very quick here. These are some of the questions that the navigator is asking to indigenous communities. So if you answer here, you will be able to compare yourself to specific indigenous communities. So have you, since 2008, experienced conflict related to land or natural resources? Did somebody come to invade your garden? Okay, we can see data is still coming in. Perhaps we move to the next one, Paloma? These are the results from two specific communities, data collected in Nepal and in Mindanao, Philippines. The Indigenous Navigator tools for participatory data collection was piloted in a number of countries, and in every single indigenous community that was asked this question, they had experienced conflicts related to land or resources. Do we have another question, Paloma? Next question, how accessible are health facilities for you? You're seeing a varied picture here. The nice blue, the immediately accessible health facilities going down a bit. So 45% of the people here in this room have immediately accessible health facilities. We see 7% with highly inaccessible health facilities. Paloma, can you show what were the results? The data collected for Solomkubu in Nepal and Mindanao in Philippines showed that health facilities for both of these communities were highly inaccessible. And there's a whole story behind what does highly inaccessible means. It means that you have to travel, that you cannot afford the cost of traveling, etc., etc. So Joji, I'm turning to you now. You're a long-term indigenous rights activist, a specialist on biodiversity and traditional knowledge, community-based monitoring, and many other things, and you are the senior policy advisor of the Forest Peoples Program. Can you tell us what is the Indigenous Navigator and how does it help in state that that element of accountability that we heard could be absent from the follow-up and review?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see that we have been enjoying the ease of generating data within this learning community. And through my past work, I'm convinced that data generation needs to be simple and empowering. And this is what we have tried to accomplish with the Indigenous Navigator. What is the Indigenous Navigator? This comprises simple monitoring tools that will track the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also the commitments made under the SDGs. from the earlier data, we saw that understanding the direct correspondence of 92% of SDG targets with economic, social, and cultural rights and civic and political rights allows us to use well-established human rights indicators to monitor progress in the SDGs. And this is what we have done with the Indigenous Navigator. So specific domains of human rights, which are covered by the UN Declaration, as well as state commitments that they have made in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, are now matched up with SDG goals and targets and are monitored through human rights indicators. For example, on land, on self-determination, cultural integrity, health, employment and occupations, education, to name a few of these rights. Now, there is already an architecture for human rights monitoring as established in international human rights law, using a structural process and outcome indicators. And what we've tried to do is to actually use this architecture and to make them into simple questionnaires, like the questions that we have been answering, but to use these questionnaires directly with the rights holders or the indigenous peoples in communities. So maybe this is best understood by giving some examples. I'll just give two examples, one on rights to land and the other one on education. So for example, the UN Declaration says that indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used and acquired. This has certain attributes to that right. For example, the maintenance of customary land tenure and respect for that. Another attribute would be legal recognition. Another one would be protection against threats. And against those attributes, we have indicators. Like, for example, are indigenous peoples' lands and territories recognized in national legislation? Yeah. What are the extent of threats that you have experienced in the past years? For example, that question about have you experienced threats? What are the proportion of people with secure rights to land, including disaggregated by sex, right? And for example, incidents of land grabbing or incidents of conflicts over lands and resources. So those kinds of indicators are made into very simple questions, like the questions that we have just asked, right? And here we have two types of questionnaires. A national questionnaire dealing with structural and process indicators, that's legal recognition as well as government programs. But importantly for the communities, the outcome indicators, their own assessment of their enjoyment and realization of that right, as well as the perceptions of whether or not this is actually being fulfilled, right? Let's go to another one on education. The UN Declaration says indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages, for example, right? And indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination. So what are some of the attributes of these rights? Access to education, availability and access to culturally appropriate education, the percentage of indigenous children finishing grades 2 and 3, finishing primary school, finishing secondary school, and state special measures to provide culturally appropriate education. And these are the types of questions that we ask, right? And I just want to, we have tried this out in, we're doing this in 11 countries. I want to talk about the experience in Cameroon, which is one of the countries where we are doing it. We are doing this with the Baka and Bagyeri people who are, have very high levels of illiteracy, right? But then when we did this community questionnaire and they were answering the questions together, they said that that was the first time that they fully understood the content and the nature of the human rights to which they had entitlement, right? So in fact, despite many human rights workshops that had been done before, it was only by them directly answering this questionnaire that they were really empowered, not only to understand the rights, but also to hold the government accountable. They went to local government to say, really, we don't have a health clinic, we have to travel so far to get our education, and there is no budgetary provision to provide for these rights. So it was a very empowering experience for the rights holders themselves to generate this data through their collective discussions. So we have no time, obviously, to display these tools, but I just want to say that if we are concerned about empowerment, accountability, and also access to justice, this is how communities use their own data to govern their localities, to speak to governments and hold them accountable, as well as some of them are seeking, for example, legal recognition of their lands through understanding the situation in the communities. So I hope that everyone will be encouraged to visit the Indigenous Navigator and use these simple tools for human rights monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joji. I really regret that what we present here are only appetizers of the many tools that are out there. And you asked the question if we are concerned with accountability. And I do think that we have somebody in the room who is very concerned with accountability. Actually, he's concerned with both transparency, accountability, and participation. And that is John Romano, who is the coordinator of exactly the Transparency, Accountability, and Participation Network, which is one of the major civil society networks pushing for these three elements in the 2030 agenda. So John, I think your intervention will follow from what we have already heard. Can you tell us how are you pushing for that, for those elements in the follow-up and review?
Yep. Thanks very much, Brigitte. It's good to be here, and I think it's good to obviously hear all the really rich discussion. I won't try and go into the details about some of the issues that we really care about because I think a lot's already been said. But just to kind of frame, where our perspectives are coming from, just a brief introduction to TAP. We're a network of over 300 organizations, civil society organizations that work in over 60 countries. And it's already been said, we work on transparency, accountability, and participation, but also SDG 16 as well as a thematic focus. And so, we saw the quiz question earlier, seeing the answer as with SDG 16 being the goal that most directly links up with UPR recommendations. I think this is a really important opportunity for us to link the SDGs with the UPR process. We know, Marianne mentioned this a bit as well, is that, we are lacking a little bit in the structure to follow up on the SDGs. And I think that much is very clear by now. And so as much as we can directly tie a lot of these issues to legally binding frameworks or frameworks that have more robust follow-up and review mechanisms, I think the better. For us, for example, it's not just the UPR, but for example, the Open Government Partnership or the UNCAC process on corruption and bribery. It's really how do we map out how colleagues and governments and even civil society are reporting to these processes, and how do we include it in this process, I think is a really difficult question to answer, but I think over the next couple of years at the very least is something that we need to wrestle with before SDG 16 is reviewed in 2019. And so, fitting in line with the theme of this particular session on tools and approaches, we're a network of civil society organizations. We mainly focused on the negotiation process to actually ensure that SDG 16 actually ended up in the SDGs in the end. So that was our primary focus over the past year and a half or 2 years or so. And so what we had to do after that, once the agenda was adopted, we did a strategic plan, a consultation with all of our members, and we really found from them that what they were most interested in is really linking up with the issues that they work on. So it wasn't just within SDG 16, but it was also in human rights and gender equality, for example. And for them, the concern was around capacity building as well. So it's one, on a communications and outreach perspective, how do we make the pitch to people beyond just us in this room, and to those that follow these processes really closely, how do we make it relevant for colleagues? For example, if you're an organization that works on gender equality, for example, and you've never heard of Goal 5 or Goal 16 in the SDGs, how do we bring those colleagues into the work that we're doing and kind of learn from one another? And I think that's a really important part of this. So what we did last year is we produced what we call the Goal 16 Advocacy Toolkit. It's available in 7 languages now. We also released a supplementary toolkit on access to justice as well. And what we hope this starts is discussions at the national level around how can civil society engage with their government or with other stakeholders to push SDG 16 commitments forward, and how can they review them as well. And so on that front, on the review and monitoring side, we've also been a big part of the what's called the SDG 16 Data Initiative. It's us and 13 other partners that came together to launch this website and platform to track progress on SDG 16. You can find it, it's really simple, sdg16.org. And for us, it's a platform to not just track progress on the indicators and provide data sources, but to also showcase data sources that come from outside of governments and national statistical offices. Because as we've heard before, I think that's a crucial part of ensuring that we have a robust picture of progress, but also for accountability purposes as well. So over time, we'll develop those indicators and the data sets through that platform as well on the monitoring side. And then finally, just one more note on reporting. I think there's a lot to learn from the human rights community on the reporting process through the UPR or other treaty body mechanisms. And I think the civil society community that works around development and the SDGs, I think, can particularly learn from those experiences as well. So one of the things that we've just actually started doing, and we had a workshop on it this morning, is to take a look at how to guide civil society organizations and networks at the national level on how to report on SDG 16, and then a bit beyond that as well, how does it relate to other SDGs. So we produced a paper that helps frame some initial guidelines and thinking. Obviously, this is a work in progress and will very much benefit from the experiences of others, including from Ganry as well. And all of this will fit into what we hope to be some broader guidance on accountability. So over the next several months, we'll also be working on a similar guide to the Goal 16 toolkit, but specifically on SDG accountability. So an SDG accountability handbook for civil society at the national level, for example. And then from there, we'll do some, obviously, national consultations and national workshops to ensure that that's reaching colleagues that really need it as well. So all of that's to say, all of this is a work in progress, and I think we should really be learning from one another within the development side of things and the human rights community. So,
thank you so much, John. I know we're very short on time, but I also think we have such a rich panel here on very important issues of accountability, participation, etc. So I just want to open up for very few questions or comments to the panel. And just imagine that you're doing it on Mentimeter. That's exactly how much time you have to ask your question now. So are there some burning issues? I see a hand here. Anybody else? Down there, and Gam. So we have 3 short questions or comments to the panel. We will start with you, Hindu, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really very interesting to see how we're engaging on human rights in all the SDGs, because for us, SDGs is really human rights. For me, it's very important to maybe reinforce the existing human rights mechanism, like we do have in Africa, many countries who have the human rights institutions, human rights committees, and they are at the national level, but they are not established well because they do not have more capacity, as John said here, and there are many others who have the capacity. So how this linkage can be really built up and give more independence of the human rights institutions at the national level, and those one can help the indigenous peoples and all our work we are doing on the ground to really react and claim our rights. And I mean, it's not claiming, to make the SDGs better implemented, to do not leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu. We had a question down there.
Yeah,
I think we need to use the mic for the interpreters, please. So just come to a table.
Yeah, thank you. Is that right? Yeah. Good. Yeah. Emily from Nestle started out talking about shared values, and presumably shared values of Nestle, ourselves in the room, and shared values with the SDGs. How do you square that with, given that some of the values is equality, how do you square that with Nestle last year giving $14.2 billion to its shareholders, about 90% of whom are in Switzerland, the USA, Germany, France, and Great Britain, rich countries. Of course, we don't know exactly who they are because you hide that behind Swiss laws where they don't have to disclose that. And your former CEO and current emeritus chairperson, who has said that water should be privatized. So I find it a little bit difficult to square those values when the SDGs, in my view, would be about, as we say here, human rights, equality, and access to water, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. A challenging question to Nestle. We'll take one more question. Gam, please.
Yeah, I just want to make this point that, as many of the speakers have said, that human rights and SDG are inseparable. I would also like to put it that it's also the vision and the aspect of political will is also inseparable. Because SDG is a visionary document as you see it, but it all now depends on the whole issue of political will, no? And because it's a visionary document, we're also talking about democratization, self-government, etc. So in this context, it's also a comment and also a question to the panel is that now it means that we have to lead to a lot of mobilization and self-organizing of the communities, or for those people who are at the furthest end of the spectrum, as we say, just like the indigenous peoples. No? So in this issue, I don't know how does the SDG look at the issue of issue of awareness at the furthest end of those people who are in the social spectrum, so that it leads to that kind of a catalyzation and self-organizing of the communities, because this is a really important issue, and so far I have not seen much of a comment on how we will achieve this. And without that kind of a participation and self-organizing of the communities, it is going to be extremely difficult for us to be moving towards this issue of accountability, citizens monitoring and so on that we have mentioned so far. Because in my experience where I have, to the very places that I've been, there is very, very little awareness and information on the SDG. So yeah, this is a question as to how we're really looking at the issue of awareness and catalyzing the communities for self-organizing.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to the panelists now for very brief remarks on these questions. I heard the word capacity building coming up, but now awareness. We have questions about how to strengthen human rights mechanisms, and we have a specific question for Nestle. So please, let's just have very brief interventions, and after that we will hear from the Ministry of the Economy from Chile, which is also working to produce tools and enhance approaches to ensure the sustainability in economic development in Chile. So please, just brief remarks.
Sure. Maybe I'll start. I'll be very brief. First off, on the comment on capacity building for national human rights institutions, I think that's actually a key complementary part of all of this, is that we need to strengthen the capacity of civil society, but also national human rights institutions, and that's part of the workshops that we've been doing is encouraging colleagues at the national level to engage with their national human rights institutions, especially in cases where there is shrinking civic space. I think those kinds of independent institutions can play a role in facilitating, the inputs of civil society in particular. So I would completely agree, and I'm hopeful that we can maybe even do some joint work on some of this going forward. On the question about outreach and awareness, I don't have a silver bullet answer here, but we've encountered that issue as well in our own experiences. When we've hosted workshops, I think we went into things assuming that people would understand the SDGs and Goal 16 in particular, but the overwhelming response was that they had no background in it. And so we have to overcome that initial obstacle of education on the SDGs. But I think it's also an important point to make that these issues are also removed from the SDGs as well. So, for example, say your government won't necessarily come out and say that they'll prioritize 16.4 on corruption and bribery. Are there other things that they've committed to on these issues that you can get them to really push? So it's a bit of a balance as well. So.
Please, Marianne, we are almost down to one-liners now.
Yeah. Two very concrete examples to your question. In order to leave no one behind, the agenda asks us to produce disaggregated data. So this is one way of identifying marginalized communities. To really push your statistics office to produce that kind of data. And another example is many countries are setting up some kind of stakeholder councils. Communities and have them represented on these councils. Okay, done.
Thank you very much. Pratima.
Just to be very with the duty bearers, with the political will, and also the dedications and advocacy has to be realized from the right holders to move further with collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joji.
I think the communities are the best and most aware of what their needs are. So they're the best experts on what should happen on the SDGs. They know about health, education, deprivation, and when you speak in simple direct communication, then they will be able to tell you everything that you need to know about what is needed to be done in the SDGs. So as human rights workers, let's not become technical. Let's really understand that human rights belongs to the people who are left behind.
Thank you, Joji. And Emily?
Thank you for the questions. We define creating shared value as creating value for society, and that includes everyone from our employees, suppliers, communities where we work. But on the other hand, the shared part of that is value for our shareholders. At the end of the day, we are a business, so that is fundamentally part of the equation. On the second question, we fully recognize and support the UN General Assembly's decision to declare a human right to water. We fully support the right to water for water and hygiene, sanitation, hydration. We have a set of public commitments against these issues, so I invite you to check them out at nestle.com/CSV. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And now we will move to a government perspective. It has been a while since we heard from government, so it would be good to, I think, end this session with you, Alejandra. You're from the Ministry for the Economy of Chile, and we are very interested to hear what you're doing in terms of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias por darnos la palabra.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I think that being the last one in line, I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Bueno, gracias. La verdad es que desde que entré a esta sala
ever since I sat down in this room, I realized about the difficulty that we've had. What is compulsory, what is already on paper. And I also heard Toribio talking with passion about the love to the nature. We, from the Ministry of Economy of Chile, we think that what is not compulsory is what is successful. There's one example to show this. yesterday, Yantu Umala went into prison for 18 months for spending public funds. In 2015, he spent $50 million in social projects. If we assume that that inflation is the same, we can see that they spend the exact same thing in the money that would generate a good impact or a positive impact in communities. So this is the challenge that we had in Chile, and we thought that only by the will of companies is that we can improve. We have a council for sustainable development. We had some reports on. One of them has to do with the good practices of businesses that has to do with collusion and corruption, and obviously that businesses can be public or private. And the second one is to be able to sign this agreement where companies can say what they're committing and why they are committing to those things. Many have said that these commitments are not legally binding, but we think that today to govern a country shouldn't have an incentive. If it has, it's a corruption, and then we should send them to prison. We think that this governance should also be given, or should also happen through talks with businesses. In the government of Chile, we implemented a program supported by the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and according to this plan, we socialized and visualized some initiatives that companies want to do, but also we are focusing ourselves in the common ground and understand human rights. For us, the biggest challenge with the business has been exactly that: explain that human rights is for everyone, and that businesses with their business function has to do with human rights, and we think that that's where the commitment of businesses lies, because it's not reasonable for companies to spend the same amount of money in corruption, and that a president receives money to achieve benefit. We think that we need to change the paradigm in which the private and the public sector, if we don't govern and talk based on dignity, based on the inclusive development, we're not going to be advanced. That's as simple as that. And that's because we are trying to hold everyone, our president, accountable for things that we don't agree with.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if that helps with the answer.
To discuss all of these interesting things, the word that I'm left with is accountability, governance, human rights. I will hand over to Roberto now just to close the session. Thanks, Roberto.
Well, thank you very much, Brigitte. And I just want to take a moment to thank all the speakers and participants for today. So can we just give everybody a round of applause who has participated so far? I just said, my name is Roberto Borrero. I'm with the International Indian Treaty Council, who's one of the co-conveners for the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. So I was very happy to be a part of this. We are closing up very quickly. Our translators have been going for quite a while, but we wanted to give the opportunity to simply 1 minute each to just two more folks who I think are here. But Atman Boucher from the National Human Rights Council of Morocco, are you here? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So just maybe just a 1 minute on for the closing. What did we learn, and how you felt what we learned? Thank you.
Very shortly.
Oh. So just raise your hand again so they could see you. He's in the back there. Should be red. It's green.
All right, thank you. So very shortly, from an NHRA perspective, I'm from the National Human Rights Council of Morocco. So for us, it's a big challenge now to monitor and report on SDGs implementation by governments. So as we consider them as being inseparable from the human rights agenda, what we're learning with workshops such as this one is to develop ideas and methods in order to carry out this monitoring. Our added value as an NHRI is that we are national platforms which link governments and non-state actors. So we're trying to coordinate the work in order to encourage development based on human rights. So with this in mind, we thank everyone who participated here for the ideas given. We're thankful to the Danish Institute and the Ganri for the studies they've developed. And we look forward to continue working with all the stakeholders who are present here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Please. And another presenter, Kume Miriti, that I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but from the Kenyan National Human Rights Commission. Are you here? Oh, in the back there.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think for us as a National Human Rights Institution, I would say, and I think it's, it applies for most of us here, what we've been doing as part of our work previously, even before the SDGs came in place, is very related to what the SDGs speak to, and therefore it's a matter of mainly mainstreaming or aligning our work to SDGs. For example, issues such as the right to health, the right to water, issues of labor rights, peace, justice, and strong institutions. These are things most of us here in the human rights sector have been working on previously. So it's a matter of trying to mainstream that. And I think one way of doing this is enhancing collaboration with state agencies that are responsible for implementation. For example, in regard to the issue of data, which has been talked a lot about. In Kenya, for example, on 26th of this month, we shall be signing a memorandum of understanding with the Kenya National Bureau of Standards, which is the state agency responsible for actually generating, or rather localizing the SDG indicators and generating data around them. So we are working with them to enhance our monitoring mandate as a national human rights institution. So the other thing I think we can enhance as NHRIs and human rights sector players is the aspect of monitoring, reporting, and of course advocacy to ensure that states live up to their expectations in regard to SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, please give them a round of applause. And yes, we've come to the close of our session today. So just very quickly, I just want to thank the co-sponsors of the event. Of course, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Gandri, Tebteba, the Permanent Mission of Denmark to the United Nations, AIPP, a Forest Peoples Program, United Nations, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, ILO, IPGIA, Ministerio de Economía, Fomento y Turismo del Gobierno de Chile, and of course the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. I think we also have, just so that you know, throughout this session you can follow the updates of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, please look for us, and we actually had this session live on there, so you can follow up and send this segments of this session to your colleagues, and I'm sure they would really appreciate and learn a lot from this. So again, thank you to all the organizers, everybody who participated and stayed here for the full term, and we hope to see you very soon throughout the rest of the HPLF. Thank you very much.